This is kind of a neat chapter too. It's a very theoretical chapter, okay? We can apply the theory practically in our daily life. The chapter is called Consumer Choice. And really, what we are looking for is value, or we often call it in here utility. And what we as consumers naturally try to do is to maximize your utility. If we buy something, we want to get the most use out of it. Products may be priced a certain way, higher, lower, medium price, whatever. But ultimately, we judge a product on how much use we get out of it. So something can be really expensive, but if we don't use it that much, or if it doesn't seem to work out as much, we've all bought clothes that we'll never wear, right? So that's a function of asking ourselves, is there any utility to that piece of clothes? On the other hand, you may have bought something that was relatively inexpensive that you find very, very, very useful. Okay, and so utility looks at how useful something is more than the price. It's not focused so much on the price, but more focused on utility. And the thought is that we as humans will naturally try to squeeze the most possible utility out of anything we buy. It assumes that we're rational consumers and that we buy things for maximum value or maximum utility. So what is interesting from an economics point of view is how do we make those choices with regards to buying things? How is it that we choose more of one thing and less of another? And all of that is really very much in the eye of the beholder. But the fact is that even in the eye of the beholder, or each individual goes through some thought process when they buy things to say, yeah, this is going to be good value for money. And because it's good value for money, I'm going to pick it over another alternative. And because we value things like that, if we bought successive things, let's say cans of Coke. Okay, you bought one can of Coke and you were really thirsty and you thought it was really good. Then I ask you, well, what if you bought a second can of Coke? Would the second can of Coke, even though it's the same price as the first can, would it provide as much pleasure to you? And you might say, most likely you're going to say, no, it won't, because the first can of Coke quenched my thirst, or I got enough of that, or, it came out my nose, these sorts of things. And you're going to say, the second can of Coke is not as valuable to me. And then I say to you, what about the fourth, or the fifth, or the seventh, or the 20th can of Coke that I successively give you? Will it provide more pleasure to you or more utility? And eventually you're going to say, no, stop. Don't give me any more. I can't have any more. So the theory says that our utility, even though we measure it each individual time we use something. And if we use things over a successive amount, multiple cans of Coke, multiple pieces of cheesecake, multiple cases of beer, multiple cars, whatever, the theory says that the utility that we get out of each successive one, something called marginal utility, declines. Okay? So the question is, if we had multiple items, how are we going to pick between them? So in this particular chapter unit, we're going to explain this basic concept of marginal utility and how it diminishes, or the law of diminishing marginal utility, it's called. And we're going to look at figuring out how consumers purchase things based on the law of diminishing marginal utility. And why do you purchase things that maximize your utility in a certain order? And we're going to explain how marginal utility theory is applicable to real-world examples. And we got lots of real-world examples. This is why I say it's mostly theory, this chapter, but we do apply it to the real world. And we can see where it can be applied to the real world. We're going to provide a theoretical rationale for downward sloping demand curves. Why does the demand curve slope down as opposed to up or level? Explain why consumers generally value products more if they pay more. Okay? Why is it that a high price often leads to a higher perceived value from a customer? And explain why some sellers charge different prices for different things for different customers. Why is it, for example, a student or a senior can get a discount, whereas an average Joe can't? And what are the benefits of that to either the users or society at large? our basic assumptions when we go into this study, when we look at this chapter, or when we look at the concepts that are talked about here, is that consumers behave rationally. We assume that we are rational buyers, and that's a fundamental concept because none of this makes any sense if we just randomly buy things, okay? We have to be a rational buyer whose goal is to maximize the value, always to maximize our value. And this is effectively what we mean by customer satisfaction. We are always, as consumers, looking to get the most out of it. And we need to purchase and consume things in a relatively short period of time. If I give you 20 cans of Coke and say, okay, drink those now, and I'm going to see what effect the 20th can has on you. If I say, well, here's a month of time, you can drink the 20 cans over a month of time, the effect is not going to be the same. So we need to be at a relatively short period of time. This only works if we think about a relatively short period of time where we're having successive items in that short period of time. A visit to a store, a visit to a restaurant, for example, works well. And sometimes the things we buy are in sets of items. So we have to buy a set of things. We could buy, I don't know, airline travel, for example, would be a set with airports, taxis, hotels. If you're going on a trip, you're going to do all those things. You just can't fly somewhere and do nothing, right? You need to have a combination of items. So utility is going to bind up with a number of things there. So here we are sat at a table in New York City, in Manhattan, and we're under a 50-story building. I'm sat there at the table. I took that picture at the table, and I'm at Junior's. They sell cheesecake there. And the guy on the bus tour said to me that that's one of the best cheesecakes in New York City. So I had to go find it and try it. And it was very good. So there's my piece of Junior's cake. I only had one piece, and it was very good. The question is, what if I had 5 pieces? What if I sat down, I ate one, and then my wife brought me another one, and then another one, and another one, and another one? What would happen? So even though I really appreciated that first piece, the second piece, I would think, and I think it would work for you too, would not have as much appeal as the first piece. I've already had one. The third piece certainly wouldn't have as much appeal as the second or the first. The time I got to the 5th piece, I'm going to say I can't eat anymore. That's too much cheesecake. It's too rich. It's too filling. Yuck. I don't want to see any more of it. So I went from thinking on the very first piece, this is wonderful. I'm so glad I can try this piece of cherry cheesecake, to the 5th piece where I said, I don't want it anymore. I just can't have it. It'll make me sick. So what brings that about? Well, we can measure it in economics terms by the amount of utility offered. And there is such a thing as total utility. And a total utility is the total value. And we measure utility in economics in something called utils. It's like gallons of gas or liters of water or whatever. It's a util. It's a measure of how full your pleasure tank is. And so, for example, this first piece of cheesecake might offer me 50 utils. The second piece of cheesecake will offer me 40 utils. It's going to go down because it's the second piece. And I've already had the first piece. One piece is generally enough. The time I got to the 5th piece, the amount of extra utility that I got out of that last piece might be negative. I don't want any more. It's going to make me sick. So total utility increases. As I, for example, if the first piece gave me 50 utils of pleasure, and the second piece gave me 40 utils of pleasure, that's a total of 90. And the third piece gave me 30 utils of pleasure. That would be a total of 120. And the 4th piece gave me 10. That would be a total of 130. And the 5th piece would be negative 10. Okay, so I'd still be going, my total utility would be going up as long as utility was positive. In other words, as long as that extra bit of utility was there. Once I hit the 5th piece, it got negative, so it started to drop off. The extra little bit of utility we get from going from one piece of cheesecake to two pieces of cheesecake, it started off at 50 and it went to 40. Okay, that extra bit, another 40 utils came with that second piece. So that's what's known as marginal utility, is the extra amount that you get on each successive piece. So the first piece, I got 50 extra from 0, nothing, to 50. And then from 50, another 40 got added on that. It was a total of 90. And then another 30 got added on that, total of 120. And then another 10 got added on that, total of 130. And then the last piece was -5, let's say, or -10. So it would bring it down. So marginal utility is the extra little bit. And one of the things we're finding is that as I get more cheesecake, it's less extra. So in other words, marginal utility diminishes as I have more and more and more. But total utility still can go up because each one is contributing a little bit more to the overall pleasure. So utility changes as we get more of a good thing is the basic thing. The difference in the amount of utility that we can get from the first to the second piece is known as our marginal utility, the extra bit. And we can actually calculate that by simply taking the change in the total utility. How much did it go up in total? So the utility went up in total by 40. So the first piece offered me 50 utils. The second piece offered me 40 utils. I had one more piece, so the total utility went from 50 to 90. So the quantity change was 1. So the total utility increased by 40 divided by 1. That means the marginal utility was considered as 40. We can see it demonstrated in a chart more easily, okay? And you can see, for example, here's one piece of cheesecake, let's say. And that one piece of cheesecake had 45 utils. It offered 45 utils. So the total utility was 45. I only have one piece of cheesecake, total utility is 45. As I move to the second piece of cheesecake, let's assume that the second piece only provided me 36. We see that the marginal utility went down. This is normal because the extra piece is not as good as the first one, right? So our marginal utility went down. Our total utility was just a 45 plus the 36, which would give us 81. The third piece, let's assume that it brought 25 utils to a pleasure. So 36 and 25, sorry, 45, 36, and 25 would total 106. Okay, so we could add these up to get 106, or we could take this one here and add this one to it. Doesn't matter which way you do it. But the total utility is 106. And then we move to the fourth piece. It brings 21 extra utility. That 21 gets added to that 106 for 127, or the combination of all these together come to 127. So you can see that total utility is rising, 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 and it gets up to 139. And what we find is in the sixth piece, there's no extra utility because we're tired of it. We've had enough. We've had 6 pieces. That's more than enough. There's no extra utility. You're making me suffer this last piece down. So our total utility stays the same. In fact, it tops out. Our total utility is highest at 139. And then when we have that seventh piece, oh my, I can't eat this. I'm going to get sick. I feel miserable. So I'm eating this against my will. The utility is a very unpleasurable -6, which brings my total utility down to 133. So what we tend to find is that marginal utility goes up, marginal utility goes down as we move along because you extra bit of pleasure. The total utility goes up as we move along to a maximum point. And whenever marginal utility hits 0, the total utility starts to drop. In other words, we're not gaining any here anymore. There's no extra benefit coming in. Now, if you're a consumer, consumers are going to try, again, rational consumers are going to try to maximize the pleasure derived. So they're going to try to maximize total utility. So ideally here, if you're a savvy customer, you're going to say, well, the maximum pleasure that I can get out of going into that restaurant would occur at 5 pieces, 139. If I have that 6 piece, I'm not getting any more pleasure out of it. I'm still at 139. So if we had to ask yourself, how many would you buy? You'd buy 5. We can see this sort of chart here graphed. You can graph it, and you can see total utility goes up, 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 and we see a pretty strong slope here, and then the slope starts flattening out because there's not that much extra benefit coming. And then we see it start to dip. This is exactly what we saw here, right? We're seeing it go up. You know, if we count the distance between is shrinking. So we get this flattening of the total utility curve, and we see marginal utility, as we've seen, declines throughout the entire process. The more we have, the less extra benefit comes from each successive one. So we could measure it, we can measure it by putting some numbers onto this. And as I say, this first piece of cheesecake, you could think of it as having a value of 200 udels. Then it drops to 30. So the marginal utility on this one from this piece to this piece, which would be 200 to a total of 230, because it'd be 200 plus the 30. There's a difference of 170 udels there. We got a drop in the marginal utility. And we can see that this marginal utility is really, can drop off quickly. And that's normally what we find. We can do a little test of this here. And again, there's nothing, it's not rocket science. This is saying, okay, here's our total utility. And what is the gap between this one and this one? So for example, in quantity of 1, we got a total utility of 20. So our marginal utility from 0 coming up to the first one was the difference between 0 and 20. So the marginal utility here would be 20. Okay? In this particular second one, our total utility was 35. So we asked ourselves, well, how much did it increase? It went from 20 to 35. Our marginal utility would be 15. In this particular one here, 3, we see the marginal utility was 10. So we know that there was an additional 10. So the total utility must have been 35 plus the 10. Okay, that would be 45. And same holds with this one down here. It was 45. 35 plus 10 is 45. 45 plus 8 would be 53. Okay, and then it went to 58, and we asked ourselves, well, what was that? Well, we know 58 plus this amount here will be this amount here. So 58 and 2 would be the marginal utility here to bring it up to 60. Okay, and then we went from 60, and some amount brought us to here, and we asked, well, okay, how do we figure that out? Well, the marginal utility was 0, so here to here, there's no real difference. So this must be 60. And there it went to -5, so this brings it down to 55. So the optimal purchasing rule then is really something that develops from this basic understanding of marginal utility. Any questions on marginal utility as a concept? So effectively what we're saying is that each successive thing gives us extra benefit, but that benefit declines as we go along with each extra one. The additional benefit declines. Total benefit still goes up, but the additional benefit declines. And there comes a point too when we get too much of a good thing, and we end up with negative utility, which causes a drop in total utilities. So we get this type of, we've seen, for example, that we get a drop off. Oops, we get a drop off. Let me just bring it here. We get a drop off in our total utility if there is a negative extra utility. So that's a wonderful concept. So you guys are going to look at that and say, well, that's great. Some economists came up with that, and what use is it? So economists have come up and said, well, okay, very good. Well, here's how we can apply this theory to human behavior. Let's look at this concept of margin utility when people have to make a choice. When people have limited or scarce resources and they have to make a choice in how much of a certain thing they buy. So in order to illustrate this, let's assume that we march off to a restaurant again. Let's go to Jerry's. And Jerry's had a couple of items there. They had cheesecake for $5 a piece. And they had coffee, fancy coffee for $5 a piece. So we've got this here, and each one of those have a $5 value on them, okay? $5 a cup. And someone says to you, okay, well, how much do you value each one in terms of utility? How much do you value? And so I put up my hand and I said, oh, okay, first piece of cheesecake, 200 utils. That's now, a util is an arbitrary measure, right? I might like cheesecake. I might say 200 utils. You might not like cheesecake. You might say it's only 50 utils to me, okay? But let's assume that the first piece of cheesecake certainly has a utility of 200. Now, because it is cheesecake and it's pretty dense, once I eat one piece, eating a second piece is not going to be that valuable to me. So I'm going to argue that my second piece of cheesecake is only going to provide me 30 utils, or 30 units of pleasure. And I'm going to also argue that if you force me to eat a third piece, it would only really have 3 units of pleasure. Okay? Now, if you ask me the same question with regards to coffee, I say, well, I really like that first cup of coffee. That's apple, cinnamon, something or another at Starbucks. Anyway, it was nice, whatever it is. And so I'm going to say it's really good. I'll give it 250 utils. Okay, that's the arbitrary measure I put on that very first cup. And then if you handed me a second cup, I'd say, look, it's still very good. It's not a really big cup of coffee. I could certainly drink 2 cups of coffee, no sweat. So 220. It's not as valuable as the first one, but it's still good and valuable. And the third one, I'm getting kind of full now, but still it has good value. It's really tasty. It's got lots of sugar in it. Just an ideal little drink, particularly on a cool day. So let's assume this is my criteria I lay out, and some economist comes up and says, okay, how is Paul, or someone like Paul, going to spend his money on buying these things? So let's set up a scenario, the economist says. Let's set up a scenario where we give Paul an amount of money. And let's assume that Paul has, $30. Let's assume Paul has $30 in his pocket. And we're going to send him into Jerry's restaurant, which has a Starbucks with it. We're going to send him into Jerry's, and we're going to bar the door and not let him out until he spends all that $30. So if I'm locked inside the restaurant, I then would say, okay, I got $30. I got to spend it. How am I going to spend that $30? In other words, how many of a given item will I buy? Well, if I had to ask you, now, what would I start off with? What do you think? I can only buy one thing at a time, too. That's another criteria. What would I start off with? What do you think I would be the most preferred item on the menu for the very first thing? What would you suggest I buy? Anyone? 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 Remember now, this is my measure of pleasure here. So which one gives me the most pleasure? Okay, so you're gonna ask which one gives me the most pleasure? This one here has 250 utils. The nearest one to it is the first piece of cheesecake, which is 200. So if I have to maximize my pleasure and I can only buy one at a time, I'm going to march up to the counter and I'm going to get this one here, this 1 cup of coffee first, because it gives me 250 units of pleasure. I hand over $5. I thought I had $30, but I think I only had 20. So I got $15 left. I go and I buy that cup of coffee. I sit down at the little table and I drink my coffee. And I'm looking up and the door is still locked. I can't leave until I spend all my money. So I'm looking up now. I've got my coffee finished. And I think to myself, what should I buy next? And the next thing I need to do then in order to figure out what am I going to buy next, I'm a rational consumer, is to evaluate what would give me the most pleasure. Well, the first piece of cheesecake will give me 200 utils of pleasure. The second cup of coffee, because I had 1 cup, second cup of coffee would give me 220 units of pleasure. So I'm going to buy the one that has the most pleasure associated with it. So this particular example here then will have me go up and purchase another cup of coffee for $5 because it's the next most valuable in terms of the amount of utility or pleasure that comes off it. So, okay, I've got $10 left. Now, I drink my coffee. It's all gone. I still have $10 in my pocket. I'm not allowed to leave until I get it all spent. So I'm looking up at the menu again, and I'm thinking to myself, what should I buy? Coffee or cheesecake? Well, let's take a look at my stated rationale here. My stated rationale is to maximize my utility. So a first piece of cheesecake, which I haven't had yet, has a utility of 200 utils. A third cup of coffee only has 150 utils. So as a rational consumer, I'm going to buy 200 utils of pleasure by buying the first piece of cheesecake. So I come back to my table. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to eat the cheesecake. I've got $5 left. Now, I have to decide what am I going to buy out of that $5. I can buy another piece of cheesecake or I can buy another coffee. Well, let's take a look at the respective utility that comes out of them. The second piece of cheesecake only has a utility of 30. The third cup of coffee has a utility of 150. So being a maximizer, I am going to pick the coffee. I'm going to say I absolutely need that coffee because that's going to be the most benefit to me. Now, if I had $20, all my money is gone. So I've met the criteria of the crazy economist that locked me in the store. But the fact is that I went and I bought 3 cups of coffee and 1 piece of cheesecake, and that provided me the maximum utility. And you ask yourself, well, what exactly is the maximum utility? Well, I just simply add them up. I got 200 utils in 1 piece of cheesecake plus 250 for the first coffee, 220 for the second coffee, and 150 for the third coffee. If I were to add them all up, out of my $20 that I spent, I had 820 utils of pleasure. And that is the maximum utility that I could get out of that $20. So that, if I'm a rational customer, that would be my purchasing choice. Now, if you go in, you might have a different utility per cup of coffee or per piece of cheesecake, and your purchasing may be different. But the process that we use to evaluate which one we should buy and which one we should not buy would be identical. Any questions on that?
No.
It's very straightforward when both of the items that we evaluate in this hypothetical model are the same. $5 and $5. We're just it's the same amount of money. So the utility per dollar is essentially the same. But you and I know that not all things are the same price. Let's assume now that we have different prices. So if you have different priced items, we need to evaluate relative utility per dollar spent. So what we need to do is say, okay, look, in this particular instance, then the cheesecake is $5 a piece, and the respective utilities are $230 and $3. The coffee is $4 a cup, so $5 a piece, $4 a cup, 250, 200, and 150 would be the respective utilities. In order to be able to evaluate what ones we should have set, we really need to consider comparing apples with apples or utility with utility. So what we do when we got different pricing is to put another column in to calculate utility per dollar. So in this particular instance, cheesecake, if we were to take the 5 and use it as the denominator, and then we take the total utility or the utility offered, and we use it as the numerator. So we take 200 and divide it by 5, and that will give us a 40 units per dollar, or 40 utils per dollar. Same thing with the 30. We take it, we divide it by 5. That would give us 6 utils per dollar. And in the case of the third piece, 3, that's 0.6 units per dollar. So all we're trying to do is to be able to get it on a per dollar basis. Same we do with coffee. We calculate it on the per dollar. So it's 250 utils. So that's 62 and a half utils per dollar, 55 utils per dollar, and 37.5 utils per dollar for each of the respective cups of coffee. Now we can say, okay, which ones are we going to buy? And using our optimal purchasing rule, we're going to buy the one that has the most utility per dollar. So most utility per dollar is 62.5 utility per dollar, and that's that first cup of coffee. Once we got that, we know we got that cost us $4. So we've actually got 20 minus the 4, which is $16 left. So we ask ourselves, what are we going to buy next? Well, we look for the next most utility per dollar. So it's 55 and 40. So we're going to buy another cup of coffee. So we go out and buy that cup of coffee, and that gives us 220 units of pleasure. We got $12 left, and we ask ourselves, okay, what would be the next level of margin utility per dollar? And we look around, we see, well, okay, the third cup of coffee is 37.5 per dollar, whereas the first piece of cheesecake is 40 per dollar. So we're going to pick that piece of cheesecake. So that gives us $7 left. And we say to ourselves, okay, we need to be able to get maximum utility, but recognizing we only have $7 left, what can we do? Well, we need to say, well, what's next on our utility list? Well, 37.5 is next highest. It's a $4 item, so that means we got $3 left. And when we got $3 left, we can't buy anymore. Notice that this is a $4 piece, a $5 piece of cheesecake, and $4. So we're going to walk out the store with $3 left. Not that we didn't try to spend it, we just couldn't. So our optimal purchasing rule, when we have differing prices, requires us to calculate utility per dollar.